I always tell people one of my three big predictors of entrepreneurial success is bias to action. And bias to action often means, once you have a sense of something that some change that's needed, that you don't delay and you make the change. And often that means acting on limited information or limited data. I had a guy who led my data science team who managed all of our model development back in the day when machine learning was in its infancy. And we called it data science. And before that, we called it math and statistics. And this guy always said, you can never have too much data and you can never have too little data, right? Any amount of data gives you more than none and gives you predictive capability. And the more data you get, the better your predictive capability gets. So to your question, I think that there's some element of, what's your priority, to act fast or to act right? And a lot of people end up causing more harm by waiting for the latter, which is acting perfectly. And then you end up spending most of your time, whether it's in business or in life, analyzing and waiting for the right answer to get all of the data you possibly could get before making a decision. And the reality is a bias to action can often be a bigger predictor of success than modeling the right outcome and making a what feels like a safer decision. I'm probably a high bias to action person, but I always want to make sure I'm making directional decisions with some degree of data.
Interesting. I remember actually also Jeff Bezos said you need to make the decision with 60 or 70% of the data, because if you wait until 100%, probably that's you're a little bit too late.
A lot of people that have been quote unquote traditionally successful people in their careers, they've been successful because they've done known things where you do a thing, you know what the outcome is going to be, and therefore you get that outcome, and therefore you feel accomplished and you continue down that path. The problem is it keeps you from doing things that are, call it unknown or unknowable, like new things like entrepreneurism. And I've seen a lot of friends who worked at Google, for example, or pick any big tech company. They went to a good high school, they got good degree, good grades, they got into a good university, they got great grades at the university, they got the good job at the big tech company. And they assumed that they were good and successful, and that therefore they could go build a company and they could go be a successful entrepreneur. The problem with entrepreneurship, however, is that as you make decisions, you often are wandering into the unknown. So you cannot, it's not a known quantity what to do. It's not a known decision, known path. So you then make a decision, you fail. And it's that feeling of failure that happens for the first time, where you're almost like drowning in a pool. You're in this place where you don't know where you're supposed to go next. And that's a very discomforting feeling for people that have been traditionally successful, because everything has been a well-worn path and they know which steps to take. And that really kind of speaks to the point about how much data is enough. I've seen friends who are consultants working at a firm like McKinsey, for example, and they're used to the data gathering analysis process. And in many cases, there isn't enough data to give you that perfectly described path of where to go in entrepreneurism. Then they gather all this data, they do all this analysis, and then they take a step, and it doesn't take them where they thought it was going to take them, but they spend all this time gathering all this data and doing all this analysis. And then all of a sudden they feel like a failure and this thing didn't work, and then they have some way to rationalize why they're going to go do something else with their life or their career. And I think that that's been the biggest kind of, I think, learning for people that have been through entrepreneurism in a successful way, meaning they found a path, they found a business, they built a business that actually worked and had good unit economics and was scalable and had a great product market fit initially and so on, and then ultimately scaled it to becoming a platform and other things, is that those people had to, at some point, get comfortable with the fact that the next step they were taking was going to be taken without all the data and all the analysis. And again, if you spend all your time doing data gathering and analysis, you run out of time. Because the thing about startups and the thing about life is there's limited time and there's limited capital. And then, burning away that time is a huge cost. So Yeah, that's a very, very long-winded answer to your short, easy question.
And do you remember the first time that you have failed?
I mean, I did a lot of great jobs growing up that I think were always important for me. I would encourage anyone that wants to be an entrepreneur to make sure that you get experience cold calling. You know, I don't know if you've ever cold called, but it's a similar sort of feeling where you're jumping into the unknown. You don't know who's going to pick up on the other side. You don't know what they're going to say, and you don't know how you're going to deal with that. That little kind of training exercise of cold calling people and then managing the sale on, trying to get them to do something or buy something over the phone is a really important muscle to strengthen, because it then plays out so much more importantly later in life, like making these tough decisions about where do I go into the unknown? Am I comfortable doing that? How do I sell someone that I've never met before? How do I get a customer to buy a product? How do I get an employee to come and work here or a team member to join me? And so I had 2 cold calling jobs in college. One was for Morgan Stanley for the brokerage office, I cold called college students to sell them on setting up brokerage accounts. I pitched them on high interest rate, which are basically money market funds, to get them to do it over having a checking account. And my broker ended up I was just the cold called guy. I got, $10 bounty for every person I signed up. And then I got him to be number 1 in the country for new accounts open that quarter. So I really pushed myself to get better at that. And then I worked for the alumni fund where you cold call alumni and you try and get them to donate to college. I think those were really important. So then I went out, I started my company years later. I was 25 years old, and I'm cold calling and going to conferences trying to sell people on this crazy weather insurance idea I had, which was go to this website, your business is affected by weather, buy insurance against the weather. And so I would go to the National Golf Course Owners Association or the Car Wash Association or the Ski Operators Association, all these different conferences, and I'd set up booths and I would be, on the front lines trying to sell customers and doing biz dev deals. I did a biz dev deal with Priceline.com, another one with Syngenta. And it was always you go in and you have to go, you don't know how the message will be received. So this is a classic kind of salesmanship muscle, but it is about failure because, you're not going to close everyone you meet. In fact, you're going to have very few closes, and you have to keep going when you get knocked down and they say no, and they say no, and they say no, and they keep slamming doors in your face. You got to keep going. I tried to raise money for my company when we first set it up. I was at Google. It was 2006. And Danny Reimer gave me, from Index Ventures, had given me a check for, I think, $300,000 or $250,000 or something like that to leave Google to start my company. But I needed to raise a couple $1 million to get this thing funded and get it off the ground. So I quit Google. I quit my cushy job. I left all my stock options on the table, all my RSUs I'd been given. It was worth a couple $1 million. And I was 25 years old back in 2005. So it was a big deal.
Yep.
And I did it without being fully funded. And Danny's I'll introduce you to all the VCs in the Valley. So I had met 2 of them from Google's board meetings, Mike Moritz and John Doerr. So I emailed them and reached out, and they both said no. And then Danny introduced me around, and all of the VCs I met said no. And I was like, well, shit, what do I do now?
Holy shit.
So then I had to go talk to all my buddies that I worked with at Google who made a bunch of money in the IPO, and I got a pass the hat going, and I raised $2.2 million from friends and networking to other people that Danny had introduced me and that my friends introduced me to, and finally I cobbled together 2.2 million, and that was the money that we used to start Weatherbill. And so yeah, from the get-go it was failure. From the get-go it was rejection. It was, you can't do this, you shouldn't do this. And then I launched the thing in January of 2007, and I'm going to conferences and trade shows trying to sell the product, and everyone's saying no, no, no. And it's easy to give up when everyone says no. It's what do I do? This was my great idea. I launched this thing, no one wants to buy it. But rather than take the no as this isn't going to work, I took the no as this is what I got to go change. And the bias to action was, let's go figure out what to change about the product. Let's go figure out how to change the pitch on it, how to change the pricing, how to change the payment schedule. We tried every iteration and eventually found all sorts of models that worked, and eventually focused on agriculture and kept changing. And suddenly the thing really took off around 2010. And so that was 2009, 2010. Yeah, so that was a really big shift in the business that I think the whole point was we were constantly failing, And, the iteration is what really drove the business to success.
Yeah, I'm happy that actually you mentioned Danny. So I just had a chat also like with his colleague Jan just before the chat with you, and he said that you are just like an incredible visionary. And to have the vision with Weatherbill back in 2005 is just incredible. So maybe you can tell us a little bit more about what is Weatherbill, how did you come up with the idea, and then looking back, what kept you motivated to push? Because probably you did have some data telling you this should exist, this should be in the market, but probably I'm not there yet with the product.
Yeah. So there were two observations. The first was I would drive past this place called the Bike Hut, and it rents bicycles on the waterfront in San Francisco, right where I used to live. And I would drive past every day. And then when it was raining, the Bike Hut would be closed down, and they wouldn't rent bikes. And I was like, oh, that's a pretty crappy business. Like, whether or not this guy makes money is like whether or not it rains. So that does not seem like a good company. I feel really bad for that guy. I wonder if there's a thing called weather insurance. And so I kind of had that thought that but it was always like a smoldering observation, right? Nothing you really act on. Then there was a day when I was sitting, I used to play a lot of poker back in my late teens, early 20s. And I'd be sitting at a card club in the Bay Area, like these seedy, disgusting card rooms. And, I'd be sitting at I was sitting at this one card table, and this guy was like a trader, a derivatives trader. And he started telling me about how Enron came about because of the energy deregulation in the mid 90s. I think it was 96. And then Enron kind of created this massive market for trading energy and all the related infrastructure. And one of the things Enron pioneered was weather derivatives, where you could basically buy a swap or derivative on temperature, because the warmer it got, the more people turned their air conditioners on and up. And so the price of energy shot up. And the more cold it got, the more people turned their heaters on and the price of energy shot up. And so Enron had created this kind of synthetic energy demand swap based on the weather. And it was well traded. But I said, why doesn't the weather derivatives market exist to all industries? Because 70% of companies are affected by the weather. And so that was kind of the connection of the observation on the Bike Hut being shut down. And there's this interesting financial instrument. And yeah, theoretically, you could sell insurance on the weather. There's plenty of weather data feeds. You don't need to have an insurance claim, et cetera. And then the third was I was a product manager on AdWords, and I worked on the real-time auction system that places the ads on Google search results. And it was really this incredible system to me to see how distributed computing enabled what would otherwise seem like very compute-intensive tasks to be resolved very immediately and very affordably from a compute perspective. And I said, well, why don't we do that with weather data? And then we could simulate the weather, and then we could let people have a website where they could specify the weather events that would cause weather loss, revenue loss, like a ski resort that shuts down when it's not enough snow, or a golf course that shuts down when it rains. They could type that in, and then we give them a price instantly, and they can buy it online. So that was the idea. It kind of connected those three things, and talked with an engineer at Google named Suraj, who's a partner at Atomico in Europe. Suraj was an early engineer at Google, been around forever, so I thought I could get him to leave and come and do this with me. So we started to kind of play with this, and I wrote all the pricing scripts in R. Suraj wrote the R Java connector and wrote the server-side stuff, and we kind of worked on the front end jointly, and mocked this thing up and used it as a demo to show to people, and that's how I ended up kind of getting the thing going. And so I don't know about being a visionary, because ultimately that business became the predominant software platform for farmers and was bought by Monsanto in 2013. So I certainly had no vision or intention of doing that. But I think maybe the more apt term, instead of being a visionary, is a little bit more of a persistent iterator, is what I would kind of call myself. And so, then again, we launched in all these verticals. We focused on agriculture around 2009, 2010. And then we really started to tune the product interface for being perfect for farmers. We changed the pricing terms that worked for farmers. We found that farmers are such a great fit because they put their whole balance sheet on the line every year. The biggest driver for whether or not they make money is the weather. And at the end, and they operate on 10 to 20% margin, sometimes less. So it was a perfect fit for farmers, and we figured out how to make it fit with existing products they were buying. We figured out how to get insurance agents that they already go to sell it for us and to market it. We built a new interface that was based on their crop and showed them all these visuals related to their farming practices. And then we started to ingest all this data. Beyond just the weather data, we started to ingest historical farm data, like what did they plant, what was their harvest, what was their yield, satellite data. We got radar data, and we built all these models that related all these data sets together. And those data sets, as a result, could be more predictive of how the weather drives outcome in farming. But it was also had all these really interesting underlying models, like how much moisture is in the soil. What is the growth stage of the plant? What is the yield of the field? When is the field going to be harvestable? So all of these underlying models that made our weather insurance work more in a more kind of seamless and simple way for farmers were actually very useful. And farmers started to buy our insurance just to see the data that we were showing every day and just to track their crop. And then we spun that off as its own product where we said, here's climate.com. It's our kind of farm analytics tool. And that really took off. I think we had about 10 million acres, which is a pretty sizable area. I think that's about 4 million hectares. Sign up to use this product, which we made free initially. And then we had the idea of charging for certain add-ons, certain models. Like it would recommend what seed to use and recommend what fertilizer to use and how much to use and when to apply it in what parts of your field. We had super high resolution maps of every one of your fields ingested. So it was like Zillow for farming, where you could click on your farm on a map, and then it would give you all this data about your farm. And that hadn't existed before we put all that together on the internet. And so, yeah, that software platform, Monsanto acquired the business for that, and it very quickly scaled. Today, almost 200 million acres globally pay a subscription fee of some sort to use that software. And I think 80% of harvesters and tractors in the US have an iPad that runs that software, and it's connected to the farm equipment. And so, yeah, it became over time just like a very deeply kind of integrated analytical tool for agriculture. And, I think that it was not at all what I intended to do with the business. So I don't know if I could possibly call myself a visionary based on where we ended up from where we started.